You're listening to the Overfunctioning Leadership Podcast, learning leadership concepts through life experience. Well, hello, and welcome to another podcast sponsored by Of Leadership. I'm Alex.
I'm John.
And I'm Zach.
And I'm Nick.
And we have a guest, as you can hear. We have Nick Kollar here. And John, before we get to Nick Kollar, this is episode 42. And this is whose episode, sir?
Well, I thought it'd be a great tribute to Jackie Robinson.
Oh, nice. That was nice. Thank you. There's no jokes to be had there. Okay, so would you like to introduce Nick?
Yeah, we have Nick Kollar with us. Nick is a sophomore at Kent State University. He is majoring in double major in both finance and economics. Nick is also the undergraduate student trustee on the board of trustees at Kent State University. So doing a lot of great things at Kent State University, and we're excited to have Nick with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. I'm excited to be here.
We're glad to have you. And Nick, also graduate of Stoneboro Falls High School. And his name, you know, if you walk around the halls, it's just echoed, like little whispers here and there.
I left my mark.
Left his mark.
It may or may not be, well, I don't know, his sister, who happens to be in one of my classes, who, you know, says his name every once in a while. Probably not in the nicest way.
Yeah, shout out to Brooke.
Big shouts out to Brooke, yeah.
So anyways, before we get into, actually our discussion today is going to be about adulting. And so taking responsibility and all those things. Before we get there, we need to recap our last podcast, gentlemen, which was about the one thing every leader should do. And so what were some of the things that we talked about? Zach?
Well, we talked about a lot of different things, but really we just prescribed some of the things that have been most impactful in our lives regarding how we have gotten to where we are at.
Okay.
And so for me, it was getting up in a tree. You know, everyone loves climbing trees as kids, and you sort of lose that. And so, like, you know, climb a tree, gain some new perspective.
No, okay, good, yeah.
Yeah, see how I tied it in there?
Yeah, I did. So then I talked about taking care of yourself and how the most important person for leadership is yourself and how to take care of yourself. And then John, he's looking as if he doesn't remember at all what he talked about.
I don't remember.
And actually, you know what? This ties right in because usually you're on spot and you know exactly what's going on. And what you talked about was doing something different. So good. So even now,
I was putting into practice what I preach.
he told some story about mooning somebody. So
I did that, yes. I think I tried to block that out. So
that's fine. Hey, by the way, for our listeners who listen a lot, Tom, in your story, was that your brother or a different Tom?
Tom, in your story,
like the mooning story.
No, different Tom.
Different
Friend Tom. Not brother Tom.
Not brother Tom. Got it. Okay. I just want to clear that up because, you know.
I'll have to go back and listen to that.
It's a good question. Like, did your brother rat you out?
Yes, no. He was home drawing, probably.
Drawing? Yes. Oh, okay. Good. Drawing scene is what I'm assuming.
Yeah, not drawing and quartering for those of you medieval folks.
What? All right. I don't even know what the heck you're talking about. All right. So anyways,
I don't follow.
I'm glad nobody does. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and jump into Fable Time, in which Nick is going to talk here in a second. But before you do that, just to get yourself ready at home, put on one pair of socks, you know, thermals or, well, smart wools, I think, woolly socks, and then go ahead and put a second pair on just to warm yourself up even more for this Fable. So with that, Nick, your Fable, sir.
Well, I got my wool socks on, so I'm good to go. So I was thinking about this, and one of my favorite books that I've read recently this year is The 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss. Like a self-help book. I've been a sucker for those lately. And there's a small story called a fable. There's no animals in it, though. So I'll go through that. So there's this young American businessman, and he decides to take some time off, and he decides to go to a local village in Mexico to get away from it all for a little bit. And the businessman gets there, and he's walking on the pier, and a fisherman's bringing his boat in, and he's tying it up. And the businessman looks in the boat, and he sees some good fish. The fisherman had a good day out there. And there's some big tuna put in a cooler. So the businessman looks at the fisherman, and he goes, wow, you must have had a good day out there. You know, how long did that take you? The fisherman said, oh, not long. So the businessman goes, well, why don't you stay out a little longer? He goes, well, I've got everything I need right here. So the businessman goes, well, what are you going to do with the rest of your day? The fisherman goes, well, I like to just go home, play with my kids, take a nap with my wife. And then in the evening, I like to go downtown and sip some wine with my friends and play some guitar. So the businessman laughs and he goes, oh, well, I'm a Harvard MBA. You know, I think you could really use me if you want to be successful in life. Here's the idea. Start fishing a little bit more. Once you start turning enough profits, well, you're going to buy another boat. Before you know it, you're going to have a whole fleet of boats. And then what we're going to do is we're going to cut out the middleman. You're going to be selling these fish directly to the producer. And before you know it, your business is going to be big enough, you're going to move out to LA. And then before you know it, you're going to be out in New York City and you're going to be building your enterprise. And the fisherman kind of looks at the businessman. He goes, well, what then? The businessman goes, well, this is where it really gets good. He goes, when your enterprise gets big enough, we're going to announce an IPO. Your company's going to go public. We're going to sell stocks on the market. And before you know it, you're going to be a millionaire. Well, the fisherman's eyes widen. He goes, a millionaire? I can't even fathom that. Well, what then? The businessman goes, well, then you retire. Then you can move out to a small village in Mexico and you can do some fishing during the day. You can go home, hang with your kids, take a nap with your wife. And then in the evening, you can go downtown and sip on wine and play guitar with your friends. So that story really struck with me because it puts into perspective the important things in life. And I think I'm at a point in my life where there's a lot of different ways I can go, a lot of roads I can take. And some might be fueled by financial needs. Some might be fueled by what I want in the long term with a family and friends and relationships. And that story puts into perspective how important it is to plan for the long term and make sure that you're taking responsible action to make sure that yourself isn't influenced by unimportant trivial things like greed and money in the long term, and that your sights are set on something higher than that, like building a strong sense of self or having a good family.
Yeah, I think that story. I'm a man who's searching after efficiency, so that story speaks to me. I found it interesting that it was very cyclical, obviously. But is that? I guess my question to you is that, do you see that you're in the business studies? That's where you're going into. Do you see that from a lot of people in your classroom now, like the people that are with you?
It's interesting because the story seems to contradict the path that I would go down in the finance world. So I think it's important to me that I have that stuck in my head, but I think it would be more important for other people to have that. So I do see that with other students my age who, I think it comes with time. It comes with time and learning and experience and actually going out in the real world. But I'm hoping to kind of mitigate some of that by thinking through it at a younger age to avoid some of those pitfalls that you could fall into.
Thus the adulting.
Thus the adulting.
Yes. So within, maybe we could just break this down into some 3 questions here. So I think a big part of it you talked about earlier with us before we had this podcast recording is that you talked about responsibility and taking more responsibility. So maybe that'll drop into the what portion. So like, what does it mean to become more of an adult? And then the second question, we can talk about what's difficult about it. And then third is like, how can you do it? Like, what are the steps you can take? So I know that's we're going to be bleeding into a lot of other things as we talk about that, but let's start with the first one. What does it mean to like take more responsibility? So we'll open it with that.
Yeah, I appreciated Nick's story and glad to have Nick on the podcast thinking through that. And when he shared that fable, I was thinking about the businessman having a vision of what life should be like and then telling another, the fisherman, how he should behave and what his life should be like. And I think it's helpful as, the question you posed is what does it mean to be an adult? And part of that journey might look like thinking for yourself of what's important to you. On our podcast in the past, we've talked about guiding principles. We have a podcast episode on that, and we refer to guiding principles in various podcast topics. But I think that may be one step of thinking about what are your guiding principles, what's important to you, what do you value in life, and so I think that's a place to start.
And I think what's so important about the idea of forming guiding principles is that that's not something that, one, you just do in a day. And it's also not something that, two, you take from other people. You can take bits and pieces from other people, but it's a different template for everybody. Mm-hmm. Everybody has their own way of looking and navigating life.
Do you feel like that some of your guiding principles, as you started to identify these now, do you find yourself getting some from your family?
I think a lot of that came from my family, but it takes time to realize it. Definitely the principle of working hard and knowing that you got to work for what you get in life, that type of thing. That came from my dad. Weekends we would wake up and go out and work on the yard and do jobs that needed to be done for our mom and that type of thing. And at first you don't like it. You push back against it.
Oh yeah.
It's the common story. But as you get older and you reflect and you step away from the family system, you start to appreciate and actually piece together what the principles are and how you can apply them to life going forward.
So would you say that you have like a different lens, or are you just pondering more on it, or you know what I mean? Like,
it's probably part of the process of adulting is that you learn to think in a more mature manner. You can articulate some of your beliefs and thoughts in a more mature way so they make more sense to you and they make more sense to others.
Would you say that you being away from the family system has given you more of a chance to do that? Like, are you living at home?
I'm not. So I'm in an apartment down the road, but I'm still close so I can visit. But even that short amount of distance, it has bigger effects. The amount of distance doesn't matter, is what I'm trying to say. Being able to separate yourself and take on some responsibility to live on your own, even just something as small as doing your own laundry and doing your own dishes. You change the way you live, and you take on a new system of living away from the family system that you spent 20 years growing up with. So definitely separating from that helps.
You talked about learning to articulate just, that whole process, what you believe, what you think, and as you come to understand it as an adult. It's just interesting. Like, we learn so much from our family of origin that aren't with words. And so we take that, and it's just like when you start talking about certain things, it's like, I really don't have the words to say what I thought I had learned. And so part of it's going back and, well, what really did my dad either say or do with me that caused me to learn that? And then the other side of that is like, well, maybe that's not actually the best lesson. Maybe I want to live my life a little different. Maybe mom taught me this with her actions, and I'm going to do everything I can to not do what mom did, I just think that's cool as you get to talk with other people about those things, that you gain perspective.
And I'm curious about cultivating guiding principles. So being a maturing self in the midst of a group. Zach, you touched on that idea of, so this is what I believe, this is what's important to me. Have you experienced reactions or input from family or others as you've tried to emerge from being a teenager to an adult? Has there been bumps in the road? Has there been pushback? Has there been resistance at all from others that are important to you as you've tried to emerge into adulthood?
Anytime you shake up the equilibrium of a system, there's going to be pushback from someone. There's somewhere in the system until it finds its new equilibrium. Yes, you do. There's, I think we've talked about this before, the idea of cleaning up your room, where you might have been a messy kid growing up and you didn't take the responsibility to put your room in order. And then there comes a day where you kind of wake up and you're like, you know what, I'm going to pick this mess up. And you do, and you clean it up and you put everything on the shelves and you vacuum and you make your bed. And then your mom walks in the room She's like, well, what are you doing? It's like, what the heck are you doing? Like, why do you think that you're better than everybody else? Because you organized your room. And this wasn't my experience, but I've heard others talk through this. And that's an interesting dynamic, because it's something so small as that. Taking responsibility for yourself shakes up the system enough to receive pushback.
And even if the behavior is an improvement, so it's not as if someone, suddenly, went downhill and a parent intervened and said, hey, what are you doing? But you're talking about someone who actually becomes more thoughtful, and people are left wondering what's really going on with this person.
I mean, there's that interesting difference between base differentiation and functional differentiation that I think is especially apparent during this time of anyone's life, because you look at someone and you're like, oh, they seem the way that they are, and you take them away from that which they've known for the past, I'd say, what would you say the average is, 18 to 22 years, somewhere in there, and suddenly they start to change, and it's how much of them is the same person and how much of them are different. I know my childhood best friend, he's still so much of the same person, but he is also entirely different. And if I were to, from an outside perspective, try and characterize the way that he's functioned, I mean, on one hand, I'd say he's really, really well adjusted. And on the other hand, I'd say he's struggled much harder than I would have expected someone from his family to have struggled, which is just an interesting observation.
So functional, just real quick, functional and base differentiation. Could you kind of explain that for us just real quick, Zach?
So when we're talking about base differentiation, that's just sort of, some synonyms are maturity, self-confidence maybe, and the idea is it's your ability to maintain this tension between self and others, togetherness and separateness, and that is who you actually are. Now, when you put it into different environments and different situations, that's your functional differentiation. And so someone with a high base differentiation is going to have relatively low variances in their functional differentiation. They're going to be more baseline. That's not to say that they won't have their ups and downs, but they're going to be relatively constant, and those people with that lower base differentiation are likely to have higher variances of functional differentiation, so they're more likely to respond emotionally rather than rationally.
That was really a thoughtful explanation for our listeners to really appreciate, and that was really helpful.
Phew, I passed John's test.
So I have a question, because you brought this up about how we're different as adults, and my question is, are we that different from when we were younger? How different are we? Because it's all about adulting, and as we become adults, are we that different from who we used to be, and how are we different?
I would say, just off of this conversation we've had already, when you start doing the things that your parents did for you. And this is different than living in a dorm, although there's some of that, a little bit of laundry here, but you're going to the dining hall and all that, right? But when you're living for yourself and you're doing everything, you're doing the cooking, you're doing the cleaning, you're doing the surviving, you either really, really appreciate what your family did for you, or maybe you come from a home where that wasn't done and you're like, man, I really, really would have hated this to have been done for me. And I mean, at the very least,
I'm going to connect that with something, Nick, you said, maybe even off camera, where you mentioned about as you take on more responsibility, I think you said something about it helps illuminate your path or helps see a path forward. And I'm wondering, in Zach's comment about as you age, you start to see a bigger story, a bigger picture of your family and maybe what's been provided for you. And so I'm wondering if there's a connection between that idea of taking on more responsibility and seeing things for what they really are, appreciating family members for what they're up against. You start to see a bigger story. And I'm trying to think of a really pointed question to ask, and so here it is. Is there a correlation between taking on more responsibility and being able to see the world actually how it is, not the way you wish it would be.
Yes. Yeah. I think the number one way to find meaning in your life is by taking on responsibility. So I think that ties along with your question. The more you try to make yourself uncomfortable and find that line of pushing yourself, but not too far, but not too little, not too much that it breaks you down and breaks you apart and you fall, but not too little where you're stagnant, indolent, and you stay the same teenager that you always were. But you take on enough responsibility that pushes you forward, and in that you can find meaning in life, and in that you mature. And along with living a meaningful life, you learn to appreciate your past, you learn to appreciate your family and the things that are actually important.
Can you share an example from your own journey where you've taken on more responsibility and how that's helped you see the clarity that you're speaking of?
So I work on campus in the Dean of Students office. And originally I was kind of just a student assistant, and I would do a lot of copying, filing, that type of thing, stapling. And then one day, you have those uncomfortable conversations with someone one up from you. And I'm like, well, is there anything else I can do? Something a little more meaningful, something else that'll actually feel like I'm actually being productive. And they said, yeah. And they're open to that. So then I started doing things more aligned with managing the budgets in the office. And these are small things in the big picture, but it's the little things that build up to a good life. So I started asking if I could help manage the budgets, and then I started asking if I could sit on in meetings. And then before you know it, it actually led to my position on the board of trustees, which has been the biggest responsibility I've taken on in my, call it, professional life, because I'm not actually at that step yet. But I've noticed along the way of more responsibility, though I've been uncomfortable, it's been the most rewarding for me mentally. It's matured me the most by having conversations with people that are on paper above me. And it's helped me grow as a person throughout college.
Zach, did you have a question?
Yeah, so related to that, I'm throwing this question out to all of us, and I think that it's nice because we got the full spectrum of ages here. We've all been through adulting or are going through it, and so for those of us either going through it or a little bit out of it, and for those of you who are well into your ruts that you've developed,
exactly.
Towards the grave. Is that? Can I say that?
Well, I think even better is to say I'm too old now to change. That's one of my favorite things. Yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed you've learned less tricks.
My ways.
It's just the way I am.
Mm-hmm. It's who I am. It's their fault.
So you have to deal with it.
But looking back, how was your adulting experience in the sense of, like, when you think about that transition period from adolescence into what you would have called, whatever that might be, adult responsibility, like, what do you remember about that? What was significant about that transition? And for us going through it, or I'd say I feel like I've already developed my ruts. I think I'm not learning any new tricks. At a ripe old age of 26, I asked my mom how old I was the other day because I forgot. I am that old. And so, how is that transition going? What's significant about it?
I just remember, in my early 20s, not being very responsible with money and having the natural consequences of irresponsibility. And it was painful enough that I thought, I don't want to repeat this, so I'm going to make some changes different. So I think one of the things that's helpful from the parenting aspect is, in a responsible way, of course, of allowing children in this case to face the natural consequences of poor decisions. And boy, it's an incentive to make some changes. So for me, that was that.
For me, I just remember, so I took a lot of advice from my mother on things, like a lot. And so that was a trend I had to break out of. But I remember my best friend, Ian, who's still my best friend, we liked the same girl. It's like the same story, right? So in college, we liked the same girl. We got in some tiff about it. I don't remember. And it came to a point to where it was like, oh, to get some advice from my mom. And she was like, I don't know if he should be your friend anymore. Or I don't remember. It went in that direction. And I think it's important to remember, not in a rebellious way, because I think as a younger person, I would just do things that, my parents would give me, hey, some advice. And then I would just choose the opposite because I was just being rebellious. And that's not what I'm talking about here. But I remember consciously thinking through, like, no, like, he's my friend. And, like, I'm making a decision now, even though at the time it was like, oh, my gosh, it's such a big thing, whatever. Like, I remember making a decision to be like, no, I'm gonna stick this out. I'm gonna change how I usually react with this. Usually Alex would sit through this and say, you know what, this is over. I don't want to deal with this. Instead, I stuck with it, and now Ian and I are really, really good friends. So I just remember that, like, starting making decisions for myself was a big step in the direction, especially when it came to relationships, I would say.
The questions that we're kind of answering, maybe to just kind of help our listeners stay along with us, is the first question is, what does it mean? Is that what we're talking about here? Or what does it mean?
Yeah, I feel like we're
for adulting.
Pretty good for that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we talked about guiding principles.
Kind of the how.
Kind of that how piece. Okay. That's helpful.
Can I add real quick on the guiding principles? One of the things that was so helpful for me in high school was sitting in on leadership lunches, because it gave me guiding principles, per se, on how to conduct myself in life and in kind of what the right ideal was for me as a high schooler. And I can remember having situations like that where I would just react differently, and I would think of a principle that we talked about or a situation we talked about in class. And it's nice to have something to base those principles off of and pull from and grow out of. And for me, it was the Bowen theory and resilient leadership in high school.
It's almost like it sets a framework instead of, thinking, I have no idea why I'm feeling this way or doing these things. Like, you don't, I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to think of growing up. Maybe I've asked myself that question. I'm very introspective and I think way too much about things. So I may have asked myself that. But, like, the framework that's given here at least gives you a background to why you're doing the things you're doing, instead of just being like, well, I don't know. It is what it is. You're just like, look, so it does really help set a nice framework to help you understand, like, what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, the question of, like, what has been instrumental in my adulting experience, it's kind of a tie together of this whole, like, principles thing mixed with, my parents, especially my mother. I really have this opinion of the way I was raised as very intentional and principled. Like, there were things that she was trying to accomplish, and it was well thought out. Like, you talk to a couple of different people and they'll tell you, like, my mom was meant to be a mom, and part of that was she was, like, studying it. She read books on it. She talked to child psychologists on the radio. She, and the way that sort of worked is, like, I feel as if I learned to think in a principled way, but as this transition into adulthood has happened, it's that idea of consequences. I feel as if I wasn't necessarily shielded from consequences, but walked through them. And the way that that's transitioned into my adult life, and to answer the question significant about adulting, is my parents have really become a resource for me where I do use them to gain perspective. When I encounter issues with my house, finding contractors for work, or experiencing relational difficulties or things like that, they've done a very good job of distinguishing themselves and saying, like, helping me to find the principles in my experience, but also giving me a perspective without pushing a prescription on me.
So it seems like to me, and I know I quoted a little bit this last time from Wayne Regina. He talked about 3 different ways that people can grow.
Good old Wayne.
Yep, good old Wayne. And it's one of those ways was adapting to what was going on. So I wonder if what you're talking about, Nick, is you talked about taking on more responsibility. By taking on that responsibility, you have to adapt. Like, I am now doing my own laundry. So that's part of my life I never did before. So I'm going to have to adapt as a person. And through that adaptation, I'm going to have to grow. Like, you're forcing yourself to grow. And so the way he has it set up, Nick, is that, like, there's 3 ways to grow as a person. One, you could go through something really hard and it gives you permanent regression of growth. So, like, this is, like, I know we've kind of joked about, like, this is the way I am, but there are certain things that have happened to people, like, young in their lives that has, like, affected them for the rest of their life, right? We know that, some of us included. And then another one is that, like, there are different things that happen during your life that force you to adapt. You have no control over, you know. And the third one is that you decide to grow yourself. And I think what you're kind of talking about is this responsibility piece of, I'm going to take on more responsibility and kind of tap into that adaptation. Like, I'm forcing myself to step into a new scenario. And you don't think through this. You're not like, well, I'm going to step in and change my homeostasis. But, like, that's kind of what you're doing. You're stepping into a new system in some ways. Like, even if it's doing your own laundry, like, this is something you haven't done before, and it's changing your whole environment. So it's almost like you're changing your system just in a one self being and making yourself adapt to the new scenario.
Yeah. And I think part of that is realizing that you're not perfect and that you're flawed and that you have to adapt. So many people can get caught in their own little echo chamber where they're comfortable, like, going back to that, being comfortable in life and not being able to get out of that. And part of being a responsible adult is realizing that you could be better. And then it's deciding what it is that you need to be better at and taking the proper steps to get there.
Yeah, and you're talking a little bit too. One of the questions that I asked was, like, why is it difficult? I mean, once you get sometimes, and we've joked about it, like, you're set in your ways. And I think that comes from a homeostasis standpoint of, this is what I'm used to and this is what's easy. But all of us would sit here and say that if you want to continually grow as a person, things aren't going to be easy going forward.
I mean, and in large part, this is all based on understanding that small truth that some acute anxieties are worth being endured for the long-term gain. And that's, where chronic anxiety comes from. I mean, and that's often something you can try to address first, is I'm unwilling to bear that heightened anxiety for a short amount of time. And it doesn't go away. It just changes form. And you end up in this regressed state for that period until something forces you to make it acute.
So something on the lines of that, acute anxiety would be, say you had a fear of public speaking, and every time you got on stage, it shook and your stomach turned and you were nervous. And then you keep putting yourself in those situations with high acute anxiety, so that eventually you become this polished, well-articulated public speaker. Is that on the lines of what you're talking about?
And on the flip side of that, looking at how that could turn into chronic anxiety is shying away from opportunities that require you to speak in groups of people. And so, it results in you avoiding opportunities that would otherwise grow your career, avoiding opportunities to grow personal skills.
I think of the word confidence and, being around high school students. And you can just see that some people lack confidence. And I think part of it can be that others bail them out when situations get difficult. But I think it's also the unwillingness to push through that acute anxiety. There's a phrase that, awkward, like to avoid awkward situations or people. And I think of valuing comfort over creation, and anxious systems want comfort and want safety versus risk. So I think pushing through that acute anxiety and the fear of what if, you can say, hey, I've grown as a public speaker or whatever it might be. I think it just gives you more confidence to try. You mentioned about responsibility, and then from stapling to budgeting to sitting in on meetings to being named by Governor Kasich on the student board of trustees at Kent State University. I think that's the journey forward for all of us. We can take that example.
And I think a lot of people struggle with building confidence because of their togetherness with other people, their fusion of their self with other people in groups. And you see that a lot in high school because you're at such a vulnerable age, a vulnerable time in your life where you try to fit in and you try to find groups that you can relate to and groups that give you confidence. And then you go off to college and you're kind of on your own. So it's like, well, how are you going to stand up for yourself? And for me, again, Bowen Theory helped me navigate high school in a genuine way to build a strong sense of self where I didn't feel like I needed groups of people to rely on to socialize or to talk through things or to mature myself.
And you mentioned leadership lunch was just something that was a forerunner to the leadership concept class, but I remember having leadership lunch, and sometimes you would be the only one that would show up. And you weren't looking around to say, okay, who else is coming? You just came because you wanted to learn. And, I think that's a visible example of one deciding to grow themselves up and making a willful choice to do that and being an individual. And anxious systems tend to herd together and find comfort in the group. But when one emerges from that and takes risks, they become a more confident, but also humble individual.
You guys talked about long-term gain and why it's important. So I was thinking this should be a good wrap-up question for tonight for the podcast. And so what is the long-term gain? We've talked about taking responsibility and adulting. Like, what is that? Like, what's your long-term gain when we're sitting here talking about Bowen Family Systems Theory? What is it?
I think the long-term gain for me is that I'll be a better person than I was sitting in this chair today. I'll be a better person 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. And that's my long-term goal. And I try to aim up as high as I can and set goals along the way to get me there. But my feeling currently is I'm happy with who I am, but I'm also unsatisfied with where I'm at. And I'm unsatisfied with how I am mentally as a person. I'm unsatisfied with some of the ways I navigate relationships in my life. And so my long-term goal isn't necessarily to work on Wall Street right now. It's not necessarily to be the CEO of a big company, but it's to be a better version of myself every single day, to be better than I was the day before, and take the small incremental steps to do that, to hopefully live a good life.
I'm going to go back to the fable that you shared at the beginning, and you talked about being a better version of yourself, and that would be a hallmark of growth. For the businessman, it was, having more boats and having, more leisure time and all those things. So for you, Nick, what would be, and maybe you're not sure of the answer to this now, and that's okay, but what might be a barometer that would tell you, like in 5 years, at 25 years of age, I've grown, and this is what I'm going to pay attention to as a measurement if I have grown as a person?
I hope people want to be around me. I hope people trust me. I think that's a gauge, and I hope people respect and listen to the things that I say and the things that I believe. I think that's important. I hope that I can have a family sometime down the road, and I hope I can take care of that family. And the steps in the barometer get bigger and bigger along the way, but I think I'll be able to navigate it by taking it one step at a time. But I just hope I can be a good person to other people without stepping on their toes and without them stepping on mine.
I think it was a really good answer. I don't know if I can really add much to it other than to say, and I think you would agree to this too, is that in growing yourself up on a daily basis and for the future, not only just affects yourself, affects the other people around you. So it affects your future family and your future wife and your, all those things. And so how much can you change your future and the people that you're hanging out with that are in your system by growing yourself up, and how that makes a huge difference. And so, yeah, whether that's at work or if you have charitable options down the road or whatever that looks like. And usually in our experiences of people who are really good leaders tend to be very humble and also very charitable towards people too. And so in various ways. So I think there's something to be said about that too. So any other final thoughts, gents?
I just have one about the payoff. I was coaching somebody recently who comes from a lot of generations of shame, especially among the females in the family, where there's a lot of guilt that's been used. How could you do this? I'm disappointed in you. Those types of words have been said, again, multi-generations. And this person has 2 daughters, and they said to me, I hear myself saying the same words, and I want to stop. And I think what Bowen Theory allows you to do is grow yourself up and to be a little bit more thoughtful. And as one does that, it allows those, you talked about Nick having a family, it allows those that directly are connected to you relationally to then be more thoughtful and have a better option of a good life journey by one leader defining themselves and saying, this generational pattern is going to stop with me, and I'm going to be intentional about growing myself up. And to this person, it was really, really important for them to think about that.
I think that'll do it. Great ending. Thank you, sir. We do have some shout outs here. First off, Nick, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. I'm indebted to you especially for helping me out and thinking through things, and all of you guys for continuing the Bowen Theory tradition with Mr. Moyer.
I think this
is so important.
I think I think it's just affected who we are as people, and you've experienced that too. And so
it's the only way to be the best.
It's the only way.
So, couple things. You can find us on iTunes, Google Play, Simplecast, YouTube, Facebook, and you can email us at
theofpodcast@gmail.com.
Boom, nailed it.
Thank you, Jesse Huffstetler, for them sick beats.
Mm-hmm.
Wub, wub, wub.
And a special shout out. I know that Nick has a special shout out to Kelly. Go.
Big shout out to Kelly Fenwick. Love you very much.
Aww.
One other thing that is kind of an accidental thing that we just started here is the Of Leadership Book Club. So if you want to join the book club, our next book that we'll be talking about is The 8 Concepts of Bowen Theory by Roberta M. Gilbert. And we'll post some things on Facebook to kind of discuss through what you guys thought about the book.
And we'll be wrapping up a book that Alex and I are reading through together by Wayne F. Regina, right? And it's pretty solid. We'll post some notes on that, and you guys can see just how insightful reading can be.
Yeah, exactly. So, with that, I am Alex.
I'm John.
I'm Zach.
And I'm Nick.
And we'll catch you next time.
Adios.
See you around.